All right, so for this week, we are going to learn how to use shape layers as well as a really cool animation tool built into After Effects called trim paths. Trim paths. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're going to build this week. You see we've got this interesting little sort of animating circles. So let's hop in and take a look at the elements used to build this. You might be looking at this and seeing all of these layers and going, oh my gosh, this is going to be complicated and hard. Okay, let me start by stating the fact that I only created one layer to make this project. I duplicated and modified that layer a bunch of times, but that's the easy part. So don't let the number of layers intimidate you, but let's go ahead and hop in. So first thing I want to do is create a new comp because I'm done with this one. I want to go down to the new comp icon right here. The new comp icon lives right here, and if I press it, it will give me what we call the default settings. You'll start to get used to these settings. Most comps, once you've done this, will default to HD TV 1080 by 24. That means 1920 by 1080. 24 frames a second. As far as resolution, we'll go full. And for the duration, it has to be at least 5 seconds. As far as our background color, we're going to set it to black. All right, and click OK. And here we are with an empty comp. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a circle, but we're not going to have a fill on this circle, which basically means we need to use the ellipse tool. So if I come up here to my toolbar, and I click on what you might see the rectangle tool, but if you click the little triangle in the corner, you can come down to the ellipse tool. And once you have the ellipse tool, before we go ahead and drag out an ellipse, we need to set our settings. Let's take a look at fill, fill color, stroke, stroke color, and stroke size. So since we're not going to have a fill, we want to turn the fill off. And the best way to do that, the only way to do that, is to click on the word fill, and that gives you your fill options, right? We have no fill, solid fill, gradient fill, or radial gradient fill. In this case, we're going to pick the no fill option. Now let's head over to stroke. Now we do want a stroke, and if you notice right now, my stroke is set to 536 pixels, which basically means you're not seeing much of a stroke unless you get really big. So right now my donut is too thick and I need to make it thinner. So let's go ahead and just crank that way back down to, I don't know, 20. Now I want to put this in the dead center of my screen, and I want to make sure that it is a perfect circle. So there's two things I'm going to do. The first one is I'm going to hold down the shift key before I start to drag out my circle. Okay, so I'm holding down shift, and now I'm going to click in the upper corner and drag out an ellipse. Now, first thing you notice is that look at the anchor point. The anchor point is defaulting to the middle of the comp and not the middle of the shape, so be aware of that. I try to get mine pretty even in there. Now, of course, I can always move the anchor point using the anchor point tool, so that's not a big deal. But if your anchor point's way off, it might make things get a little bit wonky later. And since I'm here, let's go ahead and select this layer. Let's go over to our panels, and we're going to hit this little drop down right here, right up in the corner, that says all panels. Now really I just want to use the align panel, but let's go ahead and just click all panels. With the shape layer selected, meaning that if I click off, it's deselected. If I click on it, it's selected. With that selected, I'm going to go over to Align, and I'm going to hit this one, and I'm going to hit this one. It's the Align horizontally and the Align vertically, and that should put it in the dead center of my screen, which is important because, like I said, we're only going to create one stroke or ellipse from scratch. Everything else we're going to duplicate. Okay, so now that I have this selected, let's go ahead and animate it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use a setting called trim paths to animate this. But you know, before I do, let's thicken this up just a little bit, and let's make it fluorescent green, or close to it. And you might be thinking, okay, well, we talked about animation last week, and we go down to the transform controls, and we've got position and scale and all these things and these stopwatches, but that's not what we're going to use. We want to do something special with this. We're not going to just move it side to side or up and down. We're actually going to make it grow and shrink on the screen. So we actually need to go into a spot in After Effects where we can add additional animation parameters to any layer we want to work with. By default, the only parameters we get are these 5. So if we want to add additional parameters, we need to twirl down the triangle next to the word shape layer, and you need to go to where it says Add, right over here. And if I click on this, you'll see that I can add shapes, I can add fill, stroke, gradient stroke, all these cool things. But when we get down here, this is where we can add animation parameters. Things like pucker and bloat, or repeater, or round corners, or twist, wiggle. And you notice I skipped one. I skipped one called trim paths, because that's the one we're going to use. So if I want to add that parameter to be able to animate the path, now just to be clear, in After Effects, this line right here is the path. So we're just going to click the word Add, choose Trim Paths, and you'll notice that we get an additional drop-down under Contents. So let's take a look at Contents real quick, just so we understand what's going on here. So this is a shape layer, and right now its contents are one ellipse. Now here's a really important thing to understand about shape layers. If I have this shape layer selected, as it is right now, and I create a new shape layer, watch what happens. Okay? So you see that now we have one shape layer, but inside of it, we have now 2 ellipses. So it's really important to understand that one shape layer can house multiple shapes. If I hit Command Z, you can also see that if I click off this shape layer and I drag out another shape, that sure enough, it puts it on its own layer. So again, if a shape layer is selected and you create more shapes, it'll put them inside this one layer. Now the benefits of that are that if I want to, maybe add an effect to all those shapes, or maybe I want to animate just this layer and have all those shapes move at the same time, having them all in one layer is going to speed that process up a lot, because I can just add an effect to this one layer, or I can add a transform value. Meaning, let me just show you. If I drag out a shape and I decide to click scale, now they're both going to scale up. So as you can see, if you know that you're going to use multiple shapes to do the same thing, then creating them inside one shape layer is not a bad idea. All right, moving on. So since we have our one ellipse, now in this case we don't want all of our shapes in the same layer. We want to have them all on their own layer, which means I'm going to click off after I'm done animating this. Okay, so we've got our ellipse, it's right there, and then we've got our trim paths. And as I said, trim paths is actually a parameter. If I click it, you'll see that it has a stopwatch. It says start, end, offset, and trim multiple shapes. So those are the 4 controls that trim paths adds to a shape when you click Add Trim Paths. All right, let's see what they do. So first off, you notice that the start is set to 0, end is set to 100, and offset is set to 0. Let's just focus on start and end right now, because what they do is this. I'm just going to click and drag, and you can see that if I go from 0 to 100, my shape goes from basically being visible to being invisible. It animates itself off. And then, by the same token, if I go to 100 to 0, it animates itself on. So right now, it's 0 to 100, removes it, and 100 to 0 puts it back on. Let's go look at end. Right now, end is at 100. But if I set the end to 0, look at what happens. Now notice it went the opposite direction. Let's take a look here. Notice that this one's going to the right, as I go from 0 to 100. And this one's going to the left as I go from 100 to 0. So what does it all mean? Well, it means that you have the ability to play around with it to get the results you want. Sometimes I animate the end, sometimes I animate the start. They both essentially do the same thing. If I set start to 100 and go back to 0, it does the same thing as if I grab end at 100 and walk it back to 0. So there's really not a huge difference. It's just whichever's more convenient for the results you want. Now we're actually going to animate both of them. So we'll get kind of two animations going at the same time. You can see if we pull that back a little bit, pull this back a little bit, now we get sort of a double trim paths. Also a good way to make a smiley face. But anyways, the point is, let's go ahead and animate these. And the way I'm going to have you animate them, in fact, quite honestly, I'm open to whatever you guys want to do. So I'll give you something to work with, and then you are free to do this yourself. So I'm going to set a keyframe. First off, I'm going to start this at 0. And I'm going to set a keyframe going from 0 to 100 over the course of about 5 seconds. And as you can see here, to do that, first thing I need to do is put the playhead where I want the animation to start. So I'll put it right at 0. I'll click the stopwatch for the start option. And then I'm going to drag this out. Let's go to 3 seconds rather than 5 seconds. We'll make it nice and snappy. All right, so I'm going to drag this out, and I am going to animate it to go from 0 to 100. Now, since I moved the playhead and changed the value, notice it dropped the second keyframe automatically. It dropped the first one when I clicked on the stopwatch, and it dropped the second one after I moved the playhead and changed the value. Okay, so let's back up and see what we did. So we basically created that. An animation that goes from something to nothing. All right, now let's move it forward maybe just a touch, and now let's animate the end parameter. Let's go ahead and set the end, or better yet, let's start with it in the same spot. Now we can always drag these keyframes around to see what it does. All right, so we'll set it at 0, we'll set the end, start at 100, and then we'll get over to here, 3 seconds, and we'll set the 100 down to 0. So you can see now, as we've got one side animating off, well, it's basically coming off from both sides now. And then you get to the middle, and it crosses and puts it back on. Now, if you want to stagger those, you could grab one and, I don't know, make it go faster. Let's take a look at what would happen then. Okay, so as you can see that the start animation is taking a lot longer, and because of it, you can see when the end animation starts right here, it's moving a lot faster. Kind of gives it a weird feeling. Maybe we move this one here, and we pull this one back here. Take a look at that. Okay, I liked it when they both started and ended at the same time. All right, so now we've got this. Now here comes the beauty of After Effects. We're done creating shapes. Well, at least creating them from scratch. And from here on out, we are simply going to use the rotate and scale parameters to create, I don't know, 4 or 5 more of these. So let's go ahead and do that. Offset is just allows you to change the starting point. That's really all offset does. You notice how our starting point's at 0. If I grab the offset and I crank it up to, I don't know, 50, notice that it's moved, it's offset the start and end point. That's all offset does. Crank it up even higher. You can see that it just keeps moving that start point around the circle. Now, if I had to guess, I would say we could go up to 360 before we get back to where we started. Let's go up to 300 and whatever. Okay, you can see we're just about at 360. So that's what offset does. If I set it to 0 or 360, it's going to end up doing the same thing. And then trim multiple shapes. We're not going to worry about that right now. That would just be if we had multiple shapes inside this shape layer. So let's go ahead and close this and move on. Now, since we're doing this, let's go ahead and actually offset it just a little bit. Now, there's actually two ways you could kind of accomplish this. You could use the offset command, put it maybe right there, or we could actually go in and just rotate the circle, because that would also change the start point. But again, you basically get the same results by using the offset or just spinning the circle around. Again, totally up to you. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. So the question is, how do we duplicate a layer? And this is, again, a very important key command that will save you hours. Because right now, I would have to go up here and pick a different color, click on this, drag it out, make sure it's in the right spot, align it, all this extra stuff. So instead, let's select the layer and hit Command D for duplicate. All right? Command D. Now, if you're on a PC, that's likely going to be Control D. So right now we have the same layer sitting on top of itself, and if we hit play, we really can't see a difference because they are literally right on top of each other. So let's click on shape layer number 2, hit the triangle, and better yet, instead of hitting the triangle, let's hit the S key, because that's going to bring up scale. And if I scale this down, now I have my second ellipse. But while I'm there, let's go ahead and make it look different from the first one. Now notice, as long as this is selected, the stroke is live, so I could change this to white. Click OK. I could make this very thin, almost like a little like there. Oh, and let's offset it a little bit. So again, we don't want these all doing the exact same thing. That's a little boring. So like I said, you could either rotate it, but it really probably makes more sense to go to Shape Layer 2, go to Contents, go to Trim Paths, and adjust the offset. I'm going to go complete opposite on this one. Let's do the next one. I'm going to hit Command D. And again, it's right underneath this one. It's right underneath Layer 2. I'll hit S for scale, and I'll scale it down. But for this one, I'm going to thicken it back up. So I'll go to Stroke, and I'll set the stroke to, I don't know, 181. Now, just so you know, you absolutely do not need to copy my numbers here. I'd prefer that you didn't. I want you guys to have some fun with this. Pick out your own colors, pick out your own sizes, and enjoy the process. So let's change the color to red. We'll go something saturated, maybe a little darker, sure. And then we'll just hit the triangle, and then we'll hit it again. We'll go to Contents, Trim Paths, Offset, and let's just spin it to, I don't know, might look kind of cool if these are in sync and that one isn't. So, and again, offsets, set them however you want. Really, the concept here is that, hey, we can do some amazing stuff really by just creating one layer and modifying it. So let's do a couple more. We're going to hit Command D, and we'll do the same process. We'll hit S for scale. We'll shrink it down. We will give it a different shape, meaning we'll thin it out a little bit using the stroke control pixels. Give it a different color. How about yellow? And there we go. And then we'll twirl down the triangle. We'll click the triangle, and we'll click it again. We'll go to Contents, Trim Paths, Offset, just, I don't know, right there looks good. All right, let's take a look at what we've got real quick. All right, not bad. Let's go ahead and do another one, but let's do this one outside. We'll do another one of these thin white ones. So rather than going to the top, I'm going to go back to layer number 1, hit Command D, and notice it created layer number 5, but I'm actually going to drag this one below layer number 1, just so they're in some kind of order, right? So it goes from outside to inside. And then I'll hit S for scale, scale it up a little bit. Now, I don't need to go too big because I'm actually going to make this one nice and thin. So we'll go, I want this one to be like really thin and maybe a little bit smaller. Right there, looks good. And then we'll click on the stroke color, we'll set it to white, and we'll go to trim paths, and I definitely don't want this one in sync with the other one. So again, just to clarify, I'm clicking the triangle, I'm hitting contents, I'm going to trim paths, and I am adjusting the offset. Let's go ahead and drag the playhead out so we can see a little better. And now I can see where my offset will end up. Let's go back up to layer number 4. We'll select that one. In fact, maybe we make that one a little bit bigger. Let's hit S for scale, scale it up just a touch. There we go, I like that. And now I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate it. I'm going to twirl it. I'm going to hit S. I'm going to scale it down. Now this one I'm going to make really thick using the stroke. So I'll go ahead and crank up my stroke value. I almost want like a solid looking circle here. I'll change the color to light blue. Click OK. And go down to offset, just like we have before. I'm going to click the triangle. I'm going to go to contents, trim paths, offset, and I'm just going to rotate it to, I don't know, there. And that should do it. Let's go ahead and click off and hit the spacebar. We've got a pretty interesting animation, but it feels a little too perfect right now. I don't like the fact that these two middle circles are moving at the exact same time. So let's go ahead and just select the middle circle. Now, if you don't know which one that is, that's fine. You can come in here and click. And if you click on it, it'll highlight it over here. And for that one, we can just go to offset and just, I don't know, twist it a little bit. So it's not quite so perfect. Maybe we'll make it kind of opposite the yellow one. And there we go. Interesting looking animation. I'm noticing the green and the red are pretty well synced up, and I don't love that. So let's fix that. Let's go to the red one. We'll click on it. Doesn't want to select. Let's click off and then click on it. Nope, keeps selecting the wrong one, I think. So we'll just come in here and click on layer 3. And if you're ever not sure which layer is which, you can just turn the eyeball on or off. We'll twirl it down, go to trim paths, and just do that. Now we should have a little more visual variety. I like that better. Now that we've done this, and this is it's a pretty sophisticated looking animation. It looks cool. Let's dress it up a little bit, because this to me is like one of the funnest times of any project, is when you've basically done all the animation. Now we've got a bevy of filters and blend modes and all of these things that we can use. On top of that, we could duplicate this whole thing and maybe scale it up and put it at half opacity behind. So before we get into any of that, let's select all of our layers and let's hit the U key. All right? And by hitting the U key, we can now see all of our keyframes. Again, this is one of those things in After Effects. It's very important. What we have right now are what we call linear keyframes. Okay, linear keyframes basically means that for each one of these keyframes, that when this circle starts to either grow or shrink or trim paths, it basically means that it keeps a consistent rate the entire time. Meaning it takes off at the same speed it stops at. There's never a change in speed. In certain situations that might be exactly what you're looking for. But in After Effects, we have the ability to ease keyframes. Now, easing just basically means that it starts off slow, speeds up towards the middle, and then ends slow. So let's take a quick look at the graph. If I click on this little button right here, this is called the graph editor. And if I click on it, it shows me the animation for these keyframes. Now, some of these are getting smaller, meaning going from 100% to 0. Some of these are going from 0 to 100. So you can see we've got kind of these weird lines. And this is we're not going to get super into the graph editor right now. I just want to show you that this is actually a graph representation of the motion that these are doing. Now, we don't want this linear motion. Or at least we want to see what it looks like without it. Meaning we want to ease the motion of those keyframes. So I'm going to turn off the graph editor by clicking on it again. And this time I'm just going to click and select all these keyframes. Now there's two ways to automatically ease the motion of these keyframes. One is to right click on them and go to Keyframe Assistant. And you'll see we have Easy Ease, which is sort of easing both ways, or we have Ease In or Ease Out. And again, the way I think of it is you ease into a parking spot and you ease out of your driveway. But in this case, if I just clicked Easy Ease, watch what happens to these keyframes. They all change shape. And if I click on just one of them, or maybe a couple of them, we go look at the graph editor now, you'll see that our straight lines now have this easing to them, and then they speed up, and then they sort of ease to a stop. So our straight lines have now turned into ellipses. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like. Let's back it up, hit spacebar. It's going to take a second to render, but you will notice that now it kind of has a bit of an arc to it, a wobble to it, so to speak. Let's back it up. It eases in and eases out. Which, if you ask me, makes it a little more interesting. Okay, so that is easing keyframes. Now, there's another way to do it. Let me hit Command Z. Let's select all these keyframes one more time. And rather than right-clicking and going to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease, notice we've got key commands here. Now, the weird thing about this key command is that if I just hit F9, nothing is going to happen. Now, this might be specific to my computer, I don't know. But on my computer, to do this with a key command, I have to use a modifier key, which is the FN key, and it's right next to the home key. It's on sort of the right side of your keyboard, right above your arrow keys. So if I hit FN, F9, with all my keyframes selected, you see that it automatically eases all of them. And that can add a nice effect. While we're at it, let's turn on motion blur. Now, motion blur is going to basically look at some of this motion and figure that, you know, in real life, take your hand and wiggle it in front of your face. Right now. Do it. I know you're sitting by yourself, but do it. Okay? You see your fingers blur, right? Motion blur is something we are used to seeing. Now, if I want to turn motion blur on for this assignment, I can do a couple things. Let's come down to our layer stack here. I'm going to close all these triangles. And right now, you see we have our layers, we have modes, we have track mats, and we have the option to parent and link layers. But nowhere do we have any options that refer to motion blur. So in order to get those options, we have to come straight down to where it says toggle switches modes. Right now we're in the modes view, which allows us to do things like set blend modes. If you've ever used Photoshop, you might know about these. But we want to go to the switches because we want to turn on the switch for motion blur. So let's go ahead and click toggle switches and modes. Now, this little three ball thing right here is the motion blur setting. So let's go ahead and click each one of those. Now, you might wonder, well, why is there one here and one there? Well, the reason is because motion blur is very CPU intensive, meaning it will slow your computer way down. And when you're using motion blur, you definitely want to use it, but you might be in the process of animating stuff and you might not want to have it turned on yet. In which case, you can turn it off for the project. And right now, even though these are checked, you won't see motion blur. Now, when I come over here and click and turn this on, it's going to enable it. Now, watch how long it wants to render now that I've turned on motion blur. Okay, so you can clearly see that between easing the keyframes and adding motion blur, you're going to have to deal with some pretty substantial render times. But if you look up here, you can see that we're getting these blurry edges, which is way more in line with what our eyeballs actually see in real life. Now we can go into a couple spots and play with that blur a little bit and get some really interesting effects. But for now, let's just deal with the fact that we've added the ability to create shapes, the ability to trim paths, the ability to ease keyframes, and the ability to add motion blur. Again, you see that this isn't a terribly complicated assignment to create, and in another 2 or 3 seconds we'll get to see what it looks like. And then I just want to show you how we can duplicate this. Our animation's looking pretty cool. I like it. Let's go ahead and hit the U key, and pretty much at 3 seconds is where this ends. So if we wanted to make it loop 2 more times, how could we do that? Well, there's a couple ways we could do it. We could create looping keyframes that tell it to loop. We could go play with the timing. But let's just look at some basic ways. We know that at 3 seconds, we're done. So I'm going to put the playhead right after those last keyframes. And I'm going to select all these layers. Now, if I hit Shift, Command D, not Command D, that's copy. Shift Command D is cut. And it will cut all of these layers. Watch what I do here. Command Shift D. So what it did was, it put a cut in between all those layers, which basically pushed the other half onto a new layer. Now, in this case, I don't really want any of this stuff here. I just want the animated portion over here. So the nice thing is that these are all selected. Everything to the right of the playhead is selected right now. So if I hit delete, it disappears. Cool. Now, if I want to, I could select all of these layers, hit Command C to copy, Command V to paste, and notice that it doesn't put them after the playhead. That sure would be nice. But since they're all selected, I can click on them and just drag them over. And I can hit Command V again and click on those layers and drag them over a 3rd time. So now we have this. And the nice thing is it doesn't have to render them again because we're just copying something that's already been rendered. Now, as far as dressing this up, there's endless possibilities. One thing you might consider doing, let's go ahead and undo the loop and just focus on, I'm just hitting Command Z to backspace. Let's do one thing that will make this change pretty considerably. Let's go up to layer 6, and let's hit Command D to duplicate it. Now again, this is just for fun. I'm just showing you that we can do some cool stuff here. And now let's make it really big. In fact, let's even set the stroke down to like 5. But let's turn the fill on for this layer. So I'll click Fill, Solid, OK. And then I'll hit S for Scale, and we're going to scale it up so it's the size of everything. Now, we could pretty easily drag this underneath, change its color, and, get a pretty significantly different effect. Let's give it something like, I don't know, orange. That's one way to do it. And now we have this, which again, because of motion blur is on, let's turn motion blur off. There you go. Look at how much faster it renders without motion blur. So notice that by switching to a solid, trim paths is now different. And in retrospect, I'm going to turn the fill back off. Notice how it's just kind of doing that. Which is still cool, just maybe not exactly what we wanted. So I'll turn the fill back off. And instead, I'll crank the stroke up to something ridiculous, like, I don't know, a couple thousand. Right? Let's go right there. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. And now we have something like that. So it essentially just gave us a little background element. We could change the color, put it back to orange. And all I I know I did that kind of quickly, but all I did was duplicated layer 6, dragged it to the bottom, hit S for scale, scaled it up so it was pretty much the size of the entire project, and made its stroke nice and thick so that it essentially created this background. Now, you know, again, maybe a different color might be better. Maybe like a super light gray, just to give it a slight difference from the actual black background. Something like that might be kind of cool. Another thing we could do is we could drag it up to the top and use a blend mode. Now, if you've used Photoshop, you're familiar with these. We're definitely going to talk about these in class. I'm not going to go into it right now because I want to end this tutorial for you. But I am going to switch to toggle switches and modes to take me back to my modes. And then I'm going to click and, I don't know, if I do something like overlay, I'll get a pretty interesting effect. Well, overlay is actually not doing anything. Let's try difference. Difference always gives you interesting effects. Let's see now. And of course, since the color I'm using is such a dark gray, it's not doing much. Let's set that to back to orange. And now you can see that the difference is changing my green, it's changing my white, it's really messing with everything. And again, that can be kind of cool. Blend modes can be a lot of fun. If I hit T for opacity and I drop the opacity, see I can get some interesting effects as well. And that's going to do it. So I want you to loop yours out 3 times. So let's select all these layers, Command C, Command V. We're going to drag them over here. Whoops. Command C, Command V, click, drag, Command V again, click and drag. And now I will turn on motion blur for all those layers by just clicking that little icon. And now I have everything pretty much ready to go. And we'll click File, Export, Add to Render Queue. And lossless best settings are fine. I'm going to click right here where it says Output To. And I'm going to output this to my Shapes and Paths lesson. And we'll call this Trim Paths Lesson. All right, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. And I'll hit render. And now you can see it's rendering. And I will end it right there.